Rows of bodies, still as stone, lay side by side in the dim light of a suburban mansion. The air is heavy, saturated with the scent of death and a silence that presses against the walls. Each figure is draped in the same uniform, black tracksuits, new Nike sneakers, faces obscured by veils of purple cloth. 39 souls, their hands folded, their belongings neatly arranged, as if preparing for a journey. Outside, an ordinary neighborhood in San Diego continues on, oblivious to the ritual unfolding within. But this is no ordinary scene. It is a tableau of devotion, eerily organized, chillingly serene. On March 26, 1997, police officers, summoned by an anonymous tip, step into this surreal still life. Flashlights sweep across the room, illuminating a reality that defies comprehension. There are no signs of struggle, no chaos, only a haunting order, as if each life ended by mutual consent, guided by a logic outside the world's grasp. The officers, hardened by years of service, find themselves momentarily paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of what they are witnessing. The silence is absolute, broken only by the muffled sound of footsteps on carpet and the distant hum of city life outside these walls. For the public, the images become a media spectacle, a cult suicide, another tragedy in the annals of American extremism. But beneath the headlines lies a deeper, more unsettling question. How did a group of ordinary people come to believe that death was merely a gateway to salvation? What force could twist faith, hope, and fear into a promise so absolute that it demanded everything? The world watches in confusion and horror as news anchors describe the scene, as experts speculate on the nature of belief and the boundaries of human persuasion. Yet, for those who once called themselves members of Heaven's Gate, this was not an end, but a beginning, a passage to a place they called the next level. The mansion itself becomes a character in this unfolding tragedy. Its rooms, once filled with laughter, meals, and whispered conversations, now echo with the memory of a collective decision. Personal effects, journals, identification cards, carefully labeled suitcases remain as silent witnesses to the lives that pass through here. On the kitchen table, a stack of videotapes waits to be discovered, each containing a final message, a farewell to the world they were leaving behind. The meticulousness of their preparations speaks to a conviction that is both chilling and deeply human. The need to find meaning, to belong, to be chosen for something greater. Outside, the world struggles to make sense of the incomprehensible. Reporters gather on the lawn, their voices hushed, as neighbors peer from behind curtains, trying to reconcile the quiet people they once saw with the headlines now flashing across their screens. The questions multiply. Who were these people? What did they believe? And how did they come to see death not as a tragedy, but as a triumph? This is the story of Heaven's Gate, the UFO religion that lured its followers to the edge of existence and beyond. And what waits in the shadows is far more disturbing than the final act itself. The answers lie not just in the events of that fateful night, but in the decades of longing, manipulation, and the desperate search for meaning that led 39 people to embrace the ultimate promise: that somewhere, just beyond the veil, a spaceship waited to carry them home. But what led them here is even darker than this silent room of bodies. The origins of this faith and the minds that shaped it reveal a history of longing, manipulation, and the desperate search for meaning in a world that no longer seemed to offer any. This is not just a story of death, but of the human need to believe, no matter the cost. To understand how the shadow of Heaven's Gate stretched across decades, one must trace its roots to the shifting soil of mid-20th century America, a country teetering between optimism and existential dread. In the aftermath of World War II, the world was awash with new uncertainties. The atomic age had dawned, and with it came the fear of annihilation and the promise of cosmic discovery. The night sky, once a canvas for dreams, became a stage for anxieties, flying saucers, Cold War paranoia, and the seductive idea that humanity was not alone. In this crucible, spiritual movements flourished. Traditional faiths struggled to answer questions born from trauma and rapid change. New religious currents surged, some promising rebirth, others warning of apocalypse. The 1950s and 60s witnessed a collision between the rational and the mystical. Space exploration ignited imaginations, while alien abduction stories haunted campfires and late-night radio. America was searching for a new narrative, a reason to believe in something beyond itself. The nation's living rooms flickered with images of moon landings and science fiction, while its streets pulsed with protest and counterculture. The old certainties were dissolving, replaced by a hunger for meaning that institutions could no longer satisfy. Into this restless landscape stepped Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, two seekers haunted by their own losses and obsessions. Applewhite, a man marked by personal tragedy and a profound sense of alienation, wandered through life with the ache of an unfulfilled purpose. Nettles, a nurse drawn to esoteric beliefs and the occult, saw signs and patterns where others saw only randomness. Their fateful meeting in 1972 would fuse their anxieties and ambitions, creating a partnership that would transform both their lives and, eventually, the lives of their followers forever. But before Applewhite and Nettles emerged as leaders, there was a wider cultural hunger to be fed. The late 20th century was fertile ground for the birth of new cults. Disillusionment with institutions, the breakdown of traditional communities, and the explosion of media all conspired to leave millions adrift. The promise of UFOs, of cosmic salvation just out of reach, was an irresistible tonic for those who felt invisible in the machinery of modern life. The era's technological leaps, satellites, computers, televised wars, created a paradoxical sense of both connection and isolation. For many, the world felt larger and colder than ever before. The seeds of Heaven's Gate were sown in soil rich with longing and fear. The movement would draw from older currents, the Great Awakenings, the spiritualist seances of the 19th century, but its vision was distinctly modern, shaped by satellite signals and science fiction. For those who would one day walk into that San Diego mansion, the journey began long before they met their leaders. It began in the vacuum left by a world that no longer answered their prayers. In the quiet desperation of suburbia, in the static of late-night television, in the lonely search for meaning, the ground was prepared for something extraordinary, and ultimately something tragic. But this is just the surface of the story. What truly set Heaven's Gate apart was not the era, but the strange alchemy of its founders. The next chapter reveals how two ordinary lives collided and gave birth to a doctrine that blurred the lines between salvation and destruction. Marshall Applewhite's path was scarred by quiet agony. Born to a Presbyterian preacher in Texas, he grew up encircled by hymnals and the quiet burden of expectation. His early adulthood unfolded with promise. A gifted singer, a charismatic man, he grasped for meaning in music and faith. But waves of personal loss battered him. His father's death, the collapse of his career, and a profound sense of alienation that clung to him like a shadow. Applewhite's identity fractured, haunted by desires he could neither voice nor exercise. By the early 1970s, he wandered aimlessly, a soul unmoored, searching for a sign, his life reduced to a series of empty rooms and unanswered prayers. Bonnie Nettles, in contrast, inhabited a world defined by symbols and invisible forces. A nurse and mother, she moved through life with a quiet intensity, her mind drawn to astrology, numerology, seances. She saw patterns where others saw chaos, messages in dreams and coincidences. Her marriage crumbled as her fascination with the esoteric deepened. She began to believe that a higher destiny awaited her, one encoded in the stars and hidden in plain sight. In 1972, a chance encounter in a Houston hospital, Nettles a counselor, Applewhite a patient or perhaps a visitor, set their destinies on a collision course, as if the universe itself had orchestrated their meeting. Their meeting was electric, each sensing in the other a missing piece. They spoke for hours, unraveling visions of cosmic missions and spiritual awakening. Nettles convinced Applewhite that their union had been foretold by the cosmos. Together, they believed, They would play a pivotal role in a coming transformation. Applewhite, vulnerable and desperate for direction, clung to Nettles' certainty like a lifeline. Their partnership quickly deepened into a fusion of mystical belief and psychological dependence, a symbiosis that blurred the boundaries between leader and follower. They left their old lives behind, families, jobs, histories abandoned in the pursuit of a new identity. They became the two, later Bo and Peep, spiritual shepherds in search of a flock. Drawing inspiration from Christian prophecy and science fiction, they crafted a doctrine that promised followers escape from Earth's corruption and rebirth among the stars. Salvation, they taught, would come in the form of physical ascension. Followers would shed their human bodies to join an extraterrestrial next level. Their message, at first whispered in living rooms and borrowed halls, soon spread among the spiritually restless. They promised certainty in a time of confusion, a place in the cosmic order. The pair's charisma, Applewhite's hypnotic gaze and trembling voice, Nettles' maternal calm, drew in those who felt unseen and unheard. Through late-night sessions, cryptic literature, and a growing sense of urgency, the foundation of Heaven's Gate solidified. The cult would not remain small for long. Their teachings, a strange blend of biblical apocalypse and interstellar travel, offered a seductive escape from the world's pain and ambiguity. But the union that birthed this faith was always fragile. It thrived on secrecy and mutual dependence, each leader reinforcing the other's delusions. As they gathered followers, the promise of transcendence grew more absolute and more dangerous. The doctrine would soon evolve past the bounds of metaphor and hope into something far more literal and far more deadly. Yet this collision of longing and belief heralded only the beginning. The next phase would see doctrine turn to dogma and private yearning transform into public ritual. Here begins the true descent into darkness. The transformation from strange doctrine to absolute control unfolded gradually, insidiously, as the beliefs of Applewhite and Nettles hardened into law. In the mid-1970s, the pair led their followers through a series of secretive gatherings, recruiting drifters, dreamers, and those battered by disappointment. The world outside labeled them the UFO cult, but inside, they called themselves the Crew, and every new convert was a soul chosen for a cosmic destiny, handpicked to leave behind a broken planet. The group's first true rupture with the world came in 1975. Applewhite and Nettles, now known as Do and Ty, gathered their followers in Oregon and announced the beginning of the harvest. Dozens abandoned their homes, families, and possessions, vanishing into the American wilderness like ghosts. For their families, it was a nightmare, the sudden disappearance of children, siblings, parents. The Crew, under strict instruction, erased their identities, relinquished money, and adopted new names stripped of past meaning. They traveled in caravans, holding secret meetings in parks and rented motel rooms, always vigilant for outsiders and government scrutiny. The outside world became a distant memory, replaced by the insular logic of the group. Within the group, discipline tightened. Rules multiplied. No sex, no drugs, no possessions, no contact with outsiders. Members surrendered their autonomy, their hair shaved, their clothes standardized, individuality erased in the name of spiritual purity. Every aspect of daily life was prescribed, from the folding of clothes to the cadence of speech. Doubt was cast as weakness, a sign of earthly contamination. A climate of mutual surveillance emerged, where confession and self-critique became rituals, and the group's collective will replaced private thought. The Crew lived in a perpetual state of anticipation, waiting for the sign that would mark their deliverance. As the years passed, Applewhite's authority grew absolute. Nettles, the mystical oracle, provided visions and cosmic justification, while Applewhite, the preacher, enforced obedience and fear. The Crew was told that the human body was merely a vehicle, and only by casting off all worldly attachments could one awaken to the next level. Members who wavered faced public shaming or were exiled, condemned to the existential hell of earthly existence. Some broke under the strain and fled, but for those who stayed, the bonds only tightened, their sense of self dissolving into the collective identity of the group. The first rupture came with Nettles' illness. In 1983, she was diagnosed with cancer, a mortal blow to the doctrine of physical ascension. Her death in 1985 shattered the group's illusions. For Applewhite, it was a wound that never healed. He reinterpreted her passing as a sign. The soul, not the body, would ascend. The theology shifted, but the control intensified. Applewhite, now the sole prophet, grew more isolated and erratic, his sermons laced with apocalyptic urgency and fear. The crew, now more than ever, clung to his every word, desperate for meaning in the wake of their loss. But what followed was even more disturbing. The group's isolation deepened, their rituals grew stranger, and their obedience more complete. What began as a search for meaning had become a machinery of surrender, powered by longing and fear. The descent into darkness was no longer metaphor, it was a reality, closing in with every whispered command and every voluntary loss of self. But this is where the story turns, because the most ominous phase of Heaven's Gate was yet to come. The escalation would be marked not just by faith, but by the willingness to sacrifice everything, including life itself. In the shadowed years that followed Nettles' death, Heaven's Gate became a world unto itself, sealed from the outside by layers of ritual, secrecy, and a doctrine that grew ever more radical. Applewhite, now alone at the helm, felt the weight of prophecy pressing down on him. His sermons, once tinged with cosmic wonder, became fevered proclamations of impending transformation and apocalypse. The crew, isolated in rented homes scattered across California, lived in a state of perpetual anticipation, their daily routines shaped by the belief that every moment was a rehearsal for the ultimate departure. Inside these makeshift sanctuaries, every action became ritual. Meals were taken in silence, with prayers directed not to a god, but to unseen extraterrestrial watchers. Members refer to each other by coded names and numbers, erasing the last traces of their former identities. The group's website, a strange relic of early internet culture, carried their message to a world that had grown used to their obscurity. But inside, the boundaries between reality and fantasy blurred until they could no longer be untangled. The crew meticulously documented their beliefs, recording hours of video testimony and written doctrine, as if preparing a time capsule for a civilization that would never understand them. Applewhite's control took on new dimensions. He introduced a strict regimen of celibacy. Several male members, including himself, underwent voluntary castration, believing it would help sever earthly attachments. The act, performed in secrecy and agony, became the ultimate proof of devotion, a final renunciation of the world's temptations. The crew's collective psyche tightened. Sleep deprivation, endless chores, and the repetition of doctrine drained members' ability to question. They rehearsed the details of departure, running drills for the day the sign would arrive. Their lives reduced to a choreography of obedience, each person a shadow moving in lockstep toward an unknown fate. Even the smallest deviation from routine was met with group correction, reinforcing the sense that individuality was a threat to salvation. Contact with outsiders, even with estranged family, became taboo. Letters home were filtered, phone calls scripted and rare. When families reached out, they encountered only silence, or carefully crafted reassurances that rang hollow with denial. The crew watched news reports about themselves with a detached curiosity, convinced that the world outside was doomed, and only those within the fold could be saved. The sense of us versus them grew absolute, and the outside world faded into irrelevance, replaced by the insular logic of the group's beliefs. But the world did not forget them. In the late 1990s, the comet Hale-Bopp blazed across the sky, capturing the imagination of millions. To Applewhite, it was no mere celestial event. It was the long-awaited sign, the harbinger of deliverance. He declared that a spacecraft, hidden in the comet's tail, would soon arrive to collect the faithful. The rituals intensified. Video testimonies were recorded, farewells written, and a chilling sense of finality crept through the ranks. No longer was sacrifice theoretical. Every step, every word carried the gravity of impending departure. The group's final days became a somber procession, each member preparing for the passage they believed would grant them eternal life beyond the stars. Here begins the most chilling descent, not just into collective submission, but into the embrace of oblivion itself. For the crew, the line between hope and annihilation had vanished. They marched toward their end with a serenity born not of peace, but of surrender. When the world finally glimpsed the stillness within the Rancho Santa Fe mansion, it was less a revelation than a reckoning. The images seared themselves into the collective memory. Makeshift bunk beds, the rhythmic alignment of bodies, the uniform black and purple attire, and the message left behind, a promise that the crew had simply exited their vehicles to board the next plane of existence. The reality, though, was unyielding. 39 lives extinguished, their absence echoing across news broadcasts, family homes, and the conscience of a nation. The shockwaves rippled outward, unsettling not only those who had lost loved ones, but also a society forced to confront the dark corners of faith, loneliness, and manipulation. The aftermath unraveled slowly, like a wound refusing to close. Families, estranged by years of silence, now faced the impossible task of understanding not only loss, but the choices that led to it. Many returned to empty bedrooms and unopened letters, haunted by the question of whether they could have intervened. The internet, then still in its infancy, became a forum for morbid fascination and collective mourning. The group's website, frozen in time, became a virtual mausoleum, haunted by digital ghosts, emails, farewell letters, and final declarations of faith, all preserved as evidence and warning. Strangers from around the world visited the site, some seeking answers, others drawn by the spectacle, and a few searching for a sense of connection in the void left behind. In the years that followed, the conversation shifted from spectacle to silence, from horror to uncomfortable reflection. Mental health professionals, theologians, and sociologists dissected every fragment, searching for meaning in the ruins. Cult experts warned of the enduring power of charismatic leadership and the vulnerability of those seeking belonging. Parents and siblings, left with only fragments of memory, wrestled with guilt and the ache of unanswered questions. The tragedy became a cautionary tale, a symbol of how easily the architecture of belief could be weaponized against the very souls it claimed to save. The media, after the initial frenzy, turned away, leaving families to grieve in private, their pain largely invisible to a world eager to move on. Yet, the legacy of Heaven's Gate lingers in unexpected places. The group's doctrines, once dismissed as delusion, now echo in the digital age's proliferation of online cults, conspiracy theories, and communities built on isolation and absolute conviction. The language of ascension and the search for transcendence persist, refracted through new screens and new prophets. The quiet desperation that once drove people to vanish into the world of Heaven's Gate finds fertile ground in forums and comment sections, where the promise of belonging, no matter how dark, remains irresistible. The tools of manipulation have evolved, but the hunger for meaning, for escape, for a place to belong remains unchanged. The mansion is empty now, its rooms reclaimed by quiet. But the questions it leaves behind continue to haunt. How far will we go to escape the pain of being human? What boundaries will we cross to find purpose, kinship, and absolution? In the long shadow of Heaven's Gate, the line between salvation and surrender remains thin and perilously easy to cross. The tragedy endures not only as a memory, but as a warning. A reminder that the search for transcendence, when untethered from compassion and reason, can lead us to the darkest destinations imaginable. In the shadow of the tragedy, the story of Sawyer emerges, a story not found in sensational headlines, but carried in the quiet ache that follows loss. Sawyer, one of the few surviving former members, walked away from Heaven's Gate before its final act. For years, he wandered through cities and small towns, burdened by the weight of a past that few could understand. Friends, once brothers and sisters in a cosmic family, were now only names on a list of the departed. The world, hungry for answers, often reduced his experience to a cautionary tale. But for Sawyer, it was a daily reckoning with memory and meaning. Sawyer's days became a ritual of remembering and forgetting. Each morning, he would sit by a window, sunlight spilling across old photographs and faded letters. The world outside moved on, but for him, time bent around the absence left by the group. Every song, every scent, every passing conversation was a reminder of the life he might have lived, and the lives that were lost. He answered questions from journalists and strangers with a careful reserve, never allowing them to see the full extent of his grief or the complexity of his guilt. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, he would replay the last conversations he had with those who stayed, searching for signs he might have missed, a plea for help, a moment of doubt, a chance to change the outcome. Yet, within that solitude, Sawyer found a fragile kind of grace. He spoke quietly of those who stayed, recalling moments of shared laughter and hope, memories that defied the narrative of mindless followers. He remembered the tenderness with which members cared for one another in their isolation, the sincerity with which they searched for meaning. Even as the tragedy threatened to define their legacy, Sawyer tried to honor the humanity of those who were gone. He wrote letters to families, offered condolences to parents, and lit candles on anniversary dates, forging a private ritual of remembrance that bound him to both the living and the dead. In these acts, he found a way to carry the memory of his friends forward, not as victims, but as people who, in their own way, were searching for light in the darkness. Sawyer's journey was not one of easy redemption. He struggled with guilt, with the knowledge that he had once believed, once surrendered to the same promises that led others to their end. There were days when the weight of survival felt unbearable, when the world's judgment pressed in from all sides. But there were also moments of connection, conversations with other survivors of cults, with families seeking understanding, with strangers who simply listened. In these exchanges, Sawyer discovered that healing was not about forgetting, but about weaving the pain into something that could serve as a warning and a testament. In his survival, Sawyer bore witness to the truth that even in the grip of darkness, small acts of compassion can endure. The scars remained, regret, loneliness, the ever-present question of what might have been, but so did the stubborn flicker of empathy. His story, stitched together from fragments of pain and resilience, was a testament to the complexity of those who fall under the sway of movements like Heaven's Gate. In the end, his life became a silent vow, to remember, to warn, and to keep searching for meaning in the world that was left behind. Through Sawyer, we glimpsed the enduring cost of faith misplaced, and the quiet, ongoing work of reclaiming one's humanity from the ruins. In the stillness left behind by Heaven's Gate, the world is forced to reckon with the fragile boundaries between longing and delusion, hope and surrender. The story is not simply about the tragic end of 39 lives, nor the elaborate doctrines that led them astray. It is a mirror held up to the quiet desperation that so often hides in plain sight, within families, within communities, within ourselves. The haunting silence of the empty mansion is not just the absence of voices, but the echo of questions that linger long after the headlines fade. How do we recognize the moment when yearning becomes vulnerability? When does the search for transcendence become a descent into darkness? Heaven's Gate was not built on evil, but on a hunger that echoes across generations. The need to belong, to be chosen, to escape pain, to find a higher meaning. In the absence of connection and reason, even the most intelligent, gentle souls may drift toward promises that glitter on the farthest edge of belief. What unfolded in that mansion was not only an aberration, but the outcome of a society that too often leaves its lost and searching to wander alone. The tragedy is not isolated. It is woven into the fabric of a culture that prizes certainty over curiosity and spectacle over understanding. The lesson is not to recoil in horror, nor to dismiss those who fall under such spells. The lesson is vigilance, first with ourselves, to recognize when our own needs for certainty or transcendence make us vulnerable to manipulation. It is empathy, offered to those who seek meaning without judgment or derision. And it is responsibility, a call to build communities where questions are welcomed, doubts can be voiced, and hope is grounded in reality, not fantasy. We must ask ourselves, what spaces do we create for those who feel unseen? What conversations do we foster to keep longing from curdling into despair? We are all, in our own ways, searching for purpose. The tragedy of Heaven's Gate is that this search, when untethered from compassion, skepticism, and genuine human connection, can become a path into darkness. The line between salvation and destruction is not always visible. Sometimes it is only seen in retrospect, traced by the pain of those left behind. The sorrow of Heaven's Gate is not only in the loss of life, but in the missed opportunities for intervention, for understanding, for kindness extended before it was too late. If there is any redemption in this shadow, it is found in remembering, in refusing to look away, in honoring not just the warning, but the humanity of those who vanished. Their longing, their suffering, and their hope are not so different from ours. The work of healing, of building a better world, begins with the courage to see them clearly, and with the humility to ask where our own shadows might lead us, if left unchecked. The responsibility falls to each of us to reach out, to listen, and to create bonds strong enough to withstand the pull of isolation and despair. This is not just their legacy, it is ours. The lesson is written in silence, in sorrow, and in the ongoing struggle to meet the human need for meaning with wisdom, kindness, and light. In the end, the story of Heaven's Gate is not only a warning from the past, but a plea for vigilance and compassion in the present. A reminder that the search for transcendence, if not anchored in empathy, can lead even the brightest souls into the deepest night. If you found meaning in this story, consider subscribing for more journeys into the shadows of history and the human heart. Until next time, remember, the line between light and darkness is often drawn by the choices we make together.